Hello, welcome. My name's Sarah Paxton. I am the community manager at Optimal Workshop. Thank you so much for joining for one of our lunch and learns. I know it's not lunchtime for everyone, so I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and have some bite-sized information from some of our lovely presenters. Without further ado, I will hand over to Ben and Caitlin.
Great.
Thanks, Sarah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And yeah, no mai, welcome everybody. So kia ora, my name is Caitlin. I'm a senior designer here at ThinkPlace, joined by my colleague Ben, sat right next to me here. We both work for a company called ThinkPlace, or Phygital, which, hold on, sorry. There we go. There you can probably see us slightly better now. But yeah, so we work for a company called ThinkPlace, and ThinkPlace is based here in Te Whanganui Tara, Wellington, and we also have other studios across the country and across the world. So for those of you that haven't heard of us before, we're a social purpose design agency, and our kaupapa is around designing a future that works for all, embracing complex systems, honouring all voices, enabling systemic and scalable change, and basically just thinking to make our world a better place. So the topic of our conversation today around Phygital interactions, we'll be looking at a few different ways that we've sort of brought this kaupapa to life in some of the projects that we've been involved in. But before we get into the kōrero, we'll just do some really quick intros and tell you a little bit about ourselves. So as I said, my name's Caitlin. I'm from Pōneke, Wellington, and have spent the vast majority of my life here, other than a brief stint in the mountains in Canada. I started out in design in the physical world, so as an industrial design student, and then have since kind of moved into the digital space where I studied my master's in UX design. And then over the last couple of years, I've become more and more interested in that sort of human-centered design, system and service design space. And that's sort of what's brought me to ThinkPlace. And yeah, Ben, I'll hand to you for a sec.
Kia ora, everyone. Ben McCarthy, similar background to Caitlin, an industrial design background. Grew up wanting to be a furniture designer, but more before moving into a kind of service design space. So I'm going to talk to a lot of the just kind of case studies, the sort of project examples a little bit later. And yeah, what I'm really interested in about this kind of idea is the blend of kind of the physical and digital elements, and actually how we get the best of both worlds, and how that makes better experiences for users, for customers, but also for for staff and kind of other people who might be involved in the experiences that we're talking about. Yeah.
Cool. So without further ado, the title of our talk today, the Phygital divide, what we wanted to kind of call out off the bat is really what we're passionate about is breaking down that divide. So taking those two different worlds and sort of bringing them together in a way that feels really natural and kind of brings about a positive experience for people, which is, obviously what we're wanting to do in all of the different kinds of design that we do. But before we get started, I just want to quickly clarify. So Phygital is something that if you kind of give it a bit of a Google, you might get a few different results. It's sometimes used in things like marketing, for example. But what we mean when we talk about it is really around that quite literal, like a physical environment and a digital interaction. So that's where you've got a specific sort of environment or context, and there is a digital interaction taking place within that context. And usually that interaction is to do with that environment as well. So you're quite there's like, that's a little ring fence around that. So the reason that it's really quite an interesting space to be playing in as well is that there are some quite fundamental differences between designing for digital more generally, so designing for mobile, tablet, computer versus designing in these Phygital spaces where there's some bigger clues and some stronger sort of factors that we can sort of take into account when we're designing for them. So for one, a lot of the time that position or place or moment that might be quite fixed, so you've got like a lot of strong clues there. Often that's an interaction that's needing to take place in the person in the moment, so time and space. And then as well, oftentimes there'll be a very dedicated functionality compared to, say, an app where you might be wanting to do lots and lots of different kinds of things. So yeah, generally we've got a lot stronger of an idea to begin with about what we're designing for and what people are trying to do, which can help in some ways, and it can be, an exercise in constraint in others. So yeah. obviously this is not new. We've been digitally interacting for quite a while now. So some early examples of that could be things like, buying a ticket at the train station or using an ATM or something like that. Obviously the technology then was very sort of, manual. You're using things like, push buttons and that kind of thing. And what you're able to do was quite limited. Whereas, now we've got with touch screens, along has come a lot more options for how we can kind of interact with digital interfaces. So that's started to become something that we see across the board. It used to be kind of a bit of a novel thing, maybe going through the self-checkouts in the supermarket, whereas now we kind of see entire areas reused as just self-checkout sort of lanes. And so people are becoming more and more comfortable with this way of working, and sometimes even preferring to sort of operate that way, which is quite interesting. So yeah, our comfort levels as a society are definitely increasing, and they're becoming more so the norm. So besides those really kind of, obvious examples of things like kiosks, those physical sort of booths, for example, the other thing that we'll talk about a little bit today as well is those types of digital interactions where you might still be using something like your own personal device, but it's happening in a specific moment in time. One example I can think of was, when we first sort of came out of COVID, everybody was having to do these sort of, traveler declarations. And so when you get to an airport, there's a lot to navigate there. There's a lot of signage. You're interacting with that, that interface online, but you're also interacting with people, and you've got queues, and you've got lots of different things sort of going on there, which can make it quite, confusing and stressful. So that's another type of example of where there's like a digital interaction, but that physical environment is heavily playing into sort of the success or failure of that. I don't know if any of you, traveled right after COVID, but everyone was sort of trying to figure out how to how best to kind of combine those two things, which was quite interesting. As well, another example is, if you're out to eat at a restaurant and, you see these QR codes and scanning to order at the table. So that's where you're sort of in the moment having to interact digitally, but you might not have been expecting to, for example. And so that's another interesting space that we'll sort of talk about a little bit today. So all of these different interactions I've just kind of highlighted here, a lot of what they are really doing is kind of representing a bit of a steady move away from people sort of handling all these manual interactions, and instead we've got these digital interfaces there which sort of allow us to do things ourselves, and the onus is sort of back on the consumer or the customer who is wanting to use that service. So depending on your perspective, it's not all bad, getting rid of, the bank cashier teller means that you can actually go and withdraw cash any time of day, or make a withdrawal. And so there's lots of different things that this sort of shift enables, which is amazing. In order for the shift to be a force for positive, though, and what we're really interested in is thinking about that kind of overall experience and how we design that overall experience beyond just the interface to create a really positive sort of digital interaction where that's, replacing sometimes your ability to interact with somebody. So yeah, before we get into some of the examples, Ben's going to give you a little bit of a spoiler alert for those of you that might have a really short lunch break about what some of the things are that we think when we're approaching these types of design challenges.
Cool. So the model I'm going to refer to is called the 4 Orders of Design from Richard Buchanan. Heaps on that. I'm trying to sort of slowly build those up. First 2 orders kind of symbols and things, and jokingly the kind of posters and toasters sort of space, tangible products, communication, information, that kind of thing. But everything in this digital space, and and more with the design work, we find that you're operating at kind of different levels of different orders of design. I'm trying to bring up the next 2. And that's more to do with the interactions and the environments or the organizations in which kind of experiences are taking place. And so the way that we think about this kind of Phygital idea is interactions that are sort of taking place and kind of referencing all 4 orders of design. So you're considering things like the constraints that the environment places, the mental models or the assumptions that people are bringing in from other experiences, the kind of mindset or maybe mode that they might be in at a particular time, and how all of those things start to inform or influence the behaviour that actually takes place, in a specific moment or in a specific environment. And yeah, so really, Phygital is all about the ability or the need to kind of go across all of those four orders, zoom in to certain things at certain times, whether that's pieces of information or specific interactions, zoom out to the bigger kind of environmental context or the mental modes that people might be in at any stage. And yeah, so really just thinking about the connection across all of those. So I'm going to jump into a couple of examples now. That one. So I got 3 examples for you. The first one's from New Zealand Police. Actually in relation to the family harm kind of redesign of the family harm experience that we supported police with. So we did the research, we did the sort of understanding of the discovery and the kind of problem space, and then suggested some ways forward. If you're not familiar with what a family harm incident is, the other way of thinking about it is a domestic violence incident. And obviously that's a highly stressful environment. It's a highly stressful situation. You've got police officers who have been called to an address. There are potentially kind of interactions going on between 2 or more individuals. They can be physical, they can be emotional, so there's a lot of kind of tension in the space. And what it does create is a real kind of power dynamic between police, potential offenders, and potential victims and survivors. And so that actually stops police from kind of responding maybe in the best way possible. I'm just going to flick on to the next kind of one, Caitlin. So a little bit of a kind of funny slide, but this was an example of some of the prototyping we actually did with police really early on, just to help to bring things to life, because sometimes you can't always do a walkthrough or a sort of ride along type environment when you're thinking about these kind of interactions. One of the things we had to think about was the stress of the environment, but also the information that officers had to capture, and the quality of information that you can get in a particular time. And particularly when you have a victim survivor who's just been through a highly stressful or highly traumatic event, like a family harm incident, they may or may not want to share everything that's been going on, right? And that may not lead to the best outcome ultimately in the end. And so where this project actually ended up, do you want to flick on to the next slide, is what the development team at police actually ended up creating on the back of the research that we'd done is they created a lockdown mode, right? So they thought about the fact that you've got victim survivors who need to be able to share information and share their story, but they might have the person who's offended against them in the very next room able to hear what they're saying. There might be language barriers. There might be sort of, maybe a dynamic of power or kind of maybe even mistrust with police officers. And so what the team created was a lockdown mode where the officer would hand their phone over to the person to essentially give their statement through a series of cues and sort of kind of pre-formulated questions. And that would help the officers to get better information, to remove some of that power dynamic from the environment, to remove some of that fear of being overheard, and to mean that hopefully we could end up with better outcomes for people who've experienced these things, and whether that was getting the help they need, kind of the offender being treated in the appropriate way, but it meant that they can hopefully have a lot kind of better outcomes than maybe what they were previously experiencing. The other benefit was that it reduces the amount of kind of paperwork and sort of transferring from paper to digital that police had to do, that they would typically do in their unpaid overtime. So yeah, so sort of thinking about the stress of the environment, the stress of the interaction, what's just taken place and the mindset people might be in, and then how you can actually kind of reshape or recraft that experience or that digital experience and get the most out of the digital experience in that highly stressful environment. The second example that I want to talk to is a story around the new smart gate rollout. So the kind of the digital smart gates that you see at international airports for scanning passports, et cetera, which are relatively commonplace across the world now. So If you've traveled internationally anytime, probably in the last 10 years, you will have experienced these. And what was really interesting about this was when these were new, you don't have a really easy mental model as an organization for how to use them necessarily in the best way. And you start to think of them just as, well, here's a piece of technology. It's going to, replace a portion of a person's role or a task. And so we're just going to put them in the same place that we've always put them. We would situate customs officers, for example. What we learned through this project in terms of situating ourselves in the airport, watching what people were doing, considering the environment, is we realized a couple of things. You're in a really high compliance environment in an airport. You're not wanting to do the wrong thing. You're reasonably stressed because you're worried about catching your international flight. You're wanting to get to your destination, whether that's holiday, work, whatever. But no one ever wants to kind of miss that flight. And you don't necessarily know what's coming in terms of how far ahead you can see in your journey. Sometimes you want to be able to stick together. And one of the benefits of having customs officers in place is that you can have large groups or families, et cetera, kind of go through these kind of things together, whereas the digital kind of technology enforces a one-by-one sort of very linear kind of process. And so what we did with this was we experimented with a bunch of things to do more with the physical environment, the physical layout, rather than the digital technology, because there were certain things we couldn't change with the digital tech, but there were a lot of things that we could change with where these things were situated and the layouts. And so what you sort of start to see on the right-hand photo there is one of the aha moments we had with this was actually letting people make decisions themselves. We removed queues entirely from some of the early versions of this. And it was really interesting to see the way that people would just self-navigate to a different queue. They would, if you had a large group, they would move through as one through separate smart gates instead of having to split up and kind of go one by one. Where people had children who are over the age of 12, but still maybe a little bit unconfident. You could have one parent on either side. It was just quite a sort of interesting way of modifying the physical environment to kind of get the best out of the tech. Again, just another example of kind of the kind of chaos that can kind of occur. This was a sort of an earlier example of when we still had a bunch of the kind of queue management sort of pieces going on. This is just a little diagram which we used with our client at the time to kind of allude to the way that we could go from a very linear one by one type approach and sort of enable flow through having kind of groups moving through at once, and that kind of self-selection, self-navigation idea. On to the next one. And what was quite important about this piece was that it actually enabled customs officers to shift into higher value roles and higher value in terms of they could use what they call their tradecraft to go from processing people and having people standing there in front of them and having to assess, visual cues and behavioral cues and what was going on. They were able to get out from behind their desks. They were able to wander the floor. They were able to observe people who maybe weren't behaving as they should have for a longer period of time. So they could watch, a person or a group for 10 minutes, sort of as they kind of meandered through duty free, the airport, while they were queuing up, rather than for that sort of 10, 20, 30-second interaction right in front of the customs desk. And it means that they can use that tradecraft. They can consider intelligence they've been given. They can start to really just navigate that space a little bit differently and kind of do the job that they actually really love to do. And finally, just on this one, so kind of one of the other things that the physical element actually starts to, the Phygital element starts to enable was that we were able to start to think about how do we shift people's behavior from being indecisive, confused, unsure, to very decisive. So if I'm eligible for interacting in a certain way using a smart gate, I know that I can do that. I choose the most efficient way. I know what my eligibility status is. I know that I can use this tool and I go and do it. Or if I know that I can't use this thing, I go the manual route by choice. So an example there is if you've got a business person who travels overseas a lot for work and they're used to flowing through using a smart gate, but then they're traveling with their family and they might be taking young children who are not eligible for SmartGate. All of a sudden they're in this mental switch. So they're mode switching from the way they're used to doing things on a regular basis to ways that they're unfamiliar with. But, thinking about how we could reframe the information within the environment to help passengers kind of make those more informed decisions, those more decisive decisions to go in certain directions. Cool. Are we going to tag team this one?
Sure.
Right.
Cool.
So I think maybe just briefly a little bit of overview, because I'm not sure if we've got some people kind of from within New Zealand or some people from overseas as well. Kiwi Rail is the owner of what's called the Inter-Islander Ferries. If you're in New Zealand, you'll sort of understand this. And until recently, there was some plans for crafting a couple of large new ferries that were going to transit across the Cook Strait. So what we were asked to do was to think about staff experience, customer experience, etc., within those ships and in the terminals and kind of on land as well. The design of the ships themselves was reasonably concrete. We couldn't move walls, we couldn't change the steel, we couldn't change the shape necessarily of the terminals, but within that we could influence a lot. And so this is the story of kind of how we went about that.
Yeah. And this was a really, really cool project, even just off the bat. We had some great buy-in from their team around really wanting to bring to life the things that they'd seen. So to date, there'd been a lot of, floor plans sort of shown around, which is, what you can see over here on the left, which when you're looking at it, it doesn't really mean a lot. It can give you a little bit of a sense of what those ships are going to be like, but our goal was to really bring that to life. And so we took it quite literally and literally made the space in real life. You can see on the floor there with those pieces of tape, we marked out one for one the dimensions of some of those spaces. So the one you can see mocked up here was what was called it was essentially their kind of, like a little mini supermarket basically on board, where people could go and grab, a soft drink or a sandwich or whatever they wanted to have for lunch, and then essentially take it through the checkout themselves. So that was sort of where the digital element came in. But the first thing for us to really do here was, taking a step back. We looked at it as an entire experience. So what is the experience going to be like for somebody who's wanting to kind of go and purchase food from this environment? So yeah, we basically created a bit of a mock-up, created these sort of self-checkout lanes, and then got people to actually go through the process of acting out that as if they were in the supermarket and going and buying food and then checking out the food themselves. The other little clip that you'll see there is storyboards, which were another really, really critical tool for us in terms of actually communicating that experience. So even for myself, when I first came onto this project, seeing those kind of interactions brought to life by these drawings, you can see people actually moving through the different experiences on board. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I can actually kind of start to picture the space now and visualize how people might use it. So within that, what we did was we kind of picked out what some of those key interactions were, and we obviously the process of actually going through and making the purchase is quite a big one. So we mocked that up and did a bit of a sort of dummy run. Here we go. Cool. Here's me and Ben on the tools. So what we wanted to do, as I said, was sort of test the key moments, the critical variables, and get some really good feedback from people who really understood these environments and give us some really rich feedback about how it might work or where we might trip up and things that we sort of need to be aware of. The goal at this stage was really just to get a whole bunch of feedback around what we'd sort of designed and be like, hey, here's what we're putting out there. We want your feedback. Feel free to, break it, pull it apart, put it back together again. So we're in that really kind of playful, experimental phase. What that did was that it allowed people to give us really, really high level feedback. So some of the things that we changed as a result of running these through, for example, was the actual layout of the checkouts themselves. We literally walk people through it and it's like, well, this is not enough space. And it very quickly became clear what was working and what wasn't about what we designed, which is awesome. You can see here we've got a little pretend like self-checkout. So we've got somebody to go through the process of going and grabbing some food, taking it through, paying for it, that kind of thing.
My daughter's toy paywave terminal.
Yeah, the paywave terminal did not work, but that's fine. So yeah, we created this facade of reality essentially in doing that, and that created some really insightful and accurate responses from people, which was really interesting to see. We even had people kind of refer to the kind of mental mindset that they might be in, because they could think about that, oh yeah, I know I've been in this situation before, and so what I'd be wanting to do is get through as quickly as possible, or you know, give that kind of rich feedback that otherwise we might not have had if we just had those plans. So that was really cool, bringing that to life. So the digital element within that is obviously going to be that, you know, that screen, that sort of purchasing moment where you're going and ringing in all of your items. And at this point, people are mostly really familiar with that. But when we first sort of started, we had a few ideas about what we might want to include there. We thought maybe, you know, there's a coffee cart around the corner, so maybe we'll get people to, you know, order their coffee while they're there, or maybe we want them to, you know, customize things, or maybe we want them to enter in their loyalty number, and had all these ideas, right, which seemed good in theory. And I was like, you know, making all of these screens, and it was all very exciting. But then the second we put them in front of people, it very quickly became clear, okay, actually, no, like we don't want people to be ordering coffee. People are just trying to get through. They don't want to be clicking through pop-ups essentially while they're in that moment. They just want to be in and out. So how do we enable that in the way that we design that interaction? So yeah, we had a little bit of a moment to kind of go in and test some of those finer details, but really it was less about testing the usability of that sort of flow that we'd created, and was really about testing the concept and as a whole.
The digital piece within the physical environment.
Yes, yeah, for sure. And we tested the environment too, but yeah, that was kind of the thing that we made the most changes to. So where we ended up was actually very, very pared back. So while we'd gone in with this quite like, you know, elaborate sort of flow that people could use different functionality within it, we're like, okay, what is the bare minimum that we can offer people in this moment to allow them to achieve the goal, which is basically buying food. So this was thinking back to that constraint we talked about earlier. It's one of those key principles that we know is really important in user experience design, is constraint. And I think here we applied it quite liberally to sort of give the idea that, okay, you don't want to be, you know, taking off items yourself and like doing all these different kinds of things. We did use a few different functionalities around like language, for example, and sound to help with accessibility. But other than that, the functionality is very kind of, you know, simple, get in, pay, and off you go. So
speed was of the essence.
Yeah, 100%. And so what we did as well is we knew that there would be cases where people might have, you know, accidentally entered something twice, for example. And so we built into the design of the space itself and the way that staff would be manning that area, that they would be able to help those people out rather than building it into the functionality of the screen. So yeah, as I say, where it ended up was very, very simple compared to where we began. So I guess that's probably one kind of principle I guess I learned from this exercise, is that those Phygital environments, you really need to kind of keep it to the bare minimum essentials, and yeah, keep it really simple. Testing early on meant that we figured that out. So we didn't go ahead and build a whole, you know, crazy system for people that then would have just been a pain. So yeah, the testing early, testing in a, you know, low fidelity environment was yeah, really, really important.
Cool. So how do we bridge the gap? You know, we called it the Phygital divide at the start. I really think it's more about the kind of Phygital connection and just having that in view from the very beginning. So, you know, the idea that I like to sort of share with people is, you know, it's about how do you get the best of digital interactions within a physical environment, you know, so within considering the constraints, within considering the mindsets and the mental models that people kind of bring in order to give them confidence, in order to give them assurance, in order to give them choice, you know, really thinking about the flow, thinking about, like Caitlin has said, kind of as few as touch points as possible, you know, and really just kind of not overdoing it, not overthinking it, just helping, you know, kind of do less better, basically. Yeah, not a terribly kind of complicated kind of concept.
Yeah, it's kind of a luxury in some ways. Like you kind of have less space to do things, and so you just have to be very constrained in sort of yeah, what you bring forward.
So a couple of kind of key takeaways, and then kind of open up if there's any kind of questions or thoughts that people have, is there's kind of back to that earlier slide, there's really kind of 4 kind of key parts to this. And it's not sort of fully getting away from, say, like a jobs to be done type mindset, but it's more just zooming out and continuing to go back and forth between a kind of zoom in, zoom out kind of idea. You know, always considering the mindset that someone's in. How does that actually get informed by the physical space that they're experiencing? You know, there's a high compliance mindset. If you're in an airport, you want to do things right. You want to get through security. You want to get to your flight. That family harm example, you know, it's high stress. You know, people are not generally thinking kind of logically and sort of in a really kind of calm and totally rational way. So you've got to think about those ways that those things influence the mindset. How to, you know, just literal physical constraints inform the experience, you know, what you can and can't do, how much you can and can't fit in a space. What about the environmental context? You know, like, is the weather good outside? You know, so therefore your space gets bigger. If, for example, if you're thinking about a ferry terminal, is it pouring with rain and a absolute howling Wellington southerly, in which case everybody wants to be inside the terminal, you know, and outside is not an option. So, you know, kind of thinking about the environmental context and how the constraints kind of factor. Assumptions is a really important one. You know, sometimes we're really bad at thinking people will just get stuff, but assumptions and bias that people bring in to kind of experiences is super important to kind of think about. You know, have they got that assumption about the way they've used something previously that they're bringing into this interaction? You know, that business traveler then traveling with their family, for example. How do we inform people to make better decisions early?
That assumption one relates to mental models as well, right? Like how people come into a space, they kind of think they already have a bit of an idea of how they're going to use it. So you want to sort of meet them in that at that point.
And then finally, you know, kind of just thinking about how the mix of all of these considerations, mindset, constraints, context, etc., assumptions, how does it influence what we create, what we design? You know, any good design is a trade-off between desirability, you know, usability, feasibility, etc. But you know, some of those things are going to have a greater influence. But I suppose our job is to just think about it, make informed decisions, make informed choices. Yeah,
that's right.
Cool. I think that's the end.
Yeah, that's all our talking done. So we'd love to throw it back to you all to answer any questions you might have. We'll obviously, you know, do our best to answer them, but also if there's anyone here who has their own experience they'd love to share, then yeah, we'd be really grateful to hear from you as well.